So during the post-classical period, the governments of Southeast Asia also participated extensively in the Indian Ocean trade, and the governments and people of Southeast Asia were influenced first by Indian merchants and Indian religions, and later by Muslim merchants and Muslim religions. So you can see Indian influence throughout Southeast Asia in kingdoms such as Funan in Vietnam, Angkor in Cambodia, which is pictured here, Sumatra and Java. And today a lot of the most impressive Buddhist and Hindu temples are in Southeast Asia, so this spread to Southeast Asia from India and not from China, which a lot of people initially believe or think. Islam started to become more popular in Southeast Asia in the 10th century with the conversion of areas in the Malayan Peninsula and present-day Indonesia. So people here blended Islam with local traditions, and thinking about just long-term historical significance. Indonesia today, it's the largest Islamic country in the world, or the most populated Islamic country in the world. Countries like Thailand and Cambodia are primarily Buddhist today. So, like India and Southeast Asia, Islam and trade also came to Sub-Saharan Africa. So, I'll just talk a bit about social organization in Sub-Saharan Africa, what African religion was like before the arrival of Islam, the impact of Islam and the impact of Christianity in Africa, African kingdoms that emerged as a result of trade across the Sahara Desert. So this includes the Kingdom of Ghana, the Kingdom of Mali, African kingdoms that emerged as a result of trade across the Indian Ocean, so Swahili Civilization and the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. So we read a little bit about the Bantu migrations in Guns, Germs, and Steels. So for Bantu societies in Sub-Saharan Africa, the family and extended kinship groups were the principal form of social organization, how people lived together. So people lived in villages based on extended kinship groups, and the villages were ruled by a council, and this was usually made up of the most prominent male heads of households. The most prominent male would be the chief of the village, and the chief and the village council would represent the village in terms of diplomacy with other villages in the vicinity. So groups of villages were formed, and these made up districts, and districts were typically based on common culture, shared ethnicity, but there was no central authority in a district, so all the villages were autonomous of one another. So this type of really decentralized social organization became really hard as population in Sub-Saharan Africa grew and grew, and conflicts started to erupt over land, conflicts erupted over resources, so there was a need for more centrally organized states for protection. So Africa saw the emergence of some more powerful kingdoms. We'll look at some of these, including Ghana and Mali. Before Christianity and Islam came to Africa, there wasn't one dominant belief system. African belief systems typically had in common, they emphasized morality and ethics as being essential to maintaining an orderly world. So they were practical in that sense. African people recognized divine forces that were responsible for creating life. Usually they recognized one creator, but also recognized lesser gods associated with natural features like rain and trees. Rituals typically focused on honoring gods and spirits to gain their support. Villages often had diviners who were people who were believed to be able to communicate with spirits, and these people often doubled as doctors too, so they were responsible for making medicines to treat people. So, when we looked at the rise of Islam, we saw how Islam spread to North Africa through military conquest, all the way to Spain during the time of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. In Sub-Saharan Africa, Islam spread through trade. So it's that idea spreading religion through conquest, spreading religion through trade. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it was through trade. Trade with Sub-Saharan Africa was made possible by Arab conquests of North Africa and by the introduction of the camel to Africa, which was needed for the long caravan trips across the Saharan desert. The items that would symbolize the trans-Saharan trade were gold and salt, although other items were certainly traded. Muslim traders, it's best not to think of them as missionaries because they were not forcing the religion on the people, but they were bringing a lot of wealth to Sub-Saharan Africa. Muslim traders also spoke Arabic, so people in Sub-Saharan Africa learned Arabic so they could communicate with the Muslim traders. Islam is closely connected to the Arabic language, so it was a slow process, but people living in Sub-Saharan Africa certainly saw an advantage in converting to Islam. At the same time, Islam in Sub-Saharan Africa is different than Islam in Arabia, so it was adapted for local conditions. So that word again that we want to think about is syncretism, how a religion can be adapted, blended, melded together with other traditions. So, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, women continued to work outside openly. They didn't veil themselves in public. Christianity will also come to Africa, but it was less successful than Islam. The one big exception when we talk about Christianity in Africa is Ethiopia. So in the 4th century, kings of Aksum in Ethiopia converted to Christianity, and still today, Christianity is the dominant religion in Ethiopia. But again, we have this idea of syncretism. It's a syncretic version of Christianity known as Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, which is quite different from Roman Catholicism or Greek Orthodox Christianity. So all the wealth from the trans-Saharan trade led to the establishment of some major African empires. None of them were on the scale of Eurasian empires like Rome or China, but they were still quite impressive. One of the African kingdoms that benefited a great deal from the trade was Ghana, and I spoke about Ghana a bit in episode 7. So Ghana emerged first as a regional state around 4th or 5th century, but it wasn't until the arrival of Muslim traders in the 8th century that Ghana became an extremely wealthy kingdom. So West Africa was the center for gold trade, and Ghana controlled the trade. So kings in Ghana used the wealth generated from this trade to fund big armies to protect their gold and to defend their kingdom from invasions. By the 10th century, Ghana had converted to Islam, or at least the nobility in Ghana had converted to Islam. The kings didn't impose Islam on the subjects, but people converted, especially merchants, because they saw it as being beneficial, and the kingdom in Ghana would last until the 13th century, so it lasted for quite a long time. The other major West African empire in this era that's important to know is Mali, which emerged around the same time as the decline of Ghana. And it's similar to Ghana in the sense that Mali also became wealthy off of the trans-Saharan trade. So Mali was founded by Sundiata, who was also known as the Lion King. So the Disney cartoon is based on the story of Sundiata, whose name is changed to Simba for the cartoon. And he's also turned into an actual lion in the cartoon. But the cartoon's a fable based on Sundiata's legacy, being forced to leave in his youth and gain power and allies before he could come back and claim his rightful place on the throne. So this was part of an effort by Disney in the 90s to have more of a global appeal. All the older stories like Snow White and Cinderella, they all took place in a European kingdom, like a Germanic kingdom with castles, so there's an attempt by Disney to sort of broaden its appeal a bit. So, the leader of Mali was known as Mansa, which meant King of Kings, and the 10th Emperor of Mali is a guy named Musa, so you might see him referred to as Mansa Musa. Musa was one of the first extremely devout African Muslim kings, and if we remember from when we looked at Islam, one of the pillars of Islam is to make a pilgrimage to Mecca once in your lifetime if you are physically capable of doing it and if you can afford it. So obviously this guy could afford it. He was extremely rich. So what he did is he made the pilgrimage to Mecca and brought 60,000 or so of his followers along with him. So this is the first time in history that such a large group of people from Sub-Saharan Africa visited another part of the world. When Musa returned from Mecca, he was even more devout than when he had left. He brought back lots of ideas, and he started to build lots of mosques and lots of Islamic schools all over the empire to help spread the religion. So, Islam and trade came to West Africa over the trans-Saharan trade routes, and this helped the creation of large West African empires such as Ghana and Mali. Trade and consequently Islam came to East Africa through the Indian Ocean trade. By the year 500 BCE, Eurasian mariners were already trading with East Africans, but this wasn't regular trade. It wasn't until the 10th century or so that there was regular trade happening between Eurasia and the Bantu people of East Africa. Swahili Civilization was the product of the interaction between Bantu East African people and Arab merchants. So the word Swahili is an Arabic word meaning coasters, or people that lived along the coast. And people living on the East African coast developed a unique culture that was really a blending of Bantu traditions with Arabic traditions, and a unique language influenced by both Bantu languages and Arabic. So by the 11th and 12th century, the Swahili were trading gold and slaves and ivory and other exotic goods in exchange for pottery, glass, and textiles that were brought to East Africa by Muslim merchants. So we saw a number of big cities emerge along the East African coast because of this trade. So these cities included Mogadishu, Malindi, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Mozambique, and Kilwa. Another kingdom further into the interior also emerged and became wealthy off of the East African trade, and this was the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe controlled and taxed the trade between the interior and the coast, and organized the flow of gold and ivory and slaves. So just a few quick words on slavery in Africa. African societies like Greece and Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, Mesoamerica, the Andes, most of the civilizations that we've looked at, Africa also had a long tradition of human slavery. And slaves were typically prisoners of war, debtors, so people that owed money, criminals, and people who were suspected of being witches. Slaves in Africa, they typically worked in agriculture or mines, and between the years 750 and 1500, there were around 10 million African slaves sold to the Islamic world. So this slave trade between Africa and the Islamic world laid the foundation of the Atlantic slave trade. So we won't look at the slave trade in depth right now, because we will be looking at the Atlantic slave trade more in depth, and we'll be coming back and looking at the origins of the slave trade as well. So this is the end of episode 12, Tropical Asia and Africa.